Before November 1943, the single biggest advocate that Taiwan should be an independent state was the Communist Party of China under Chairman Mao Zedong. That's a fact, but most people don't know that. So it's clear to me that it was Xi Jinping who tried to make sure that the security of his leadership could no longer be challenged again, that he did whatever was needed. If it means reversing a flagship policy he had committed to only a few weeks ago, so be it. That's a lesson we need to learn in terms of how Xi Jinping runs the Communist Party and China. It would have sent a cold through your spine. You would have realized that you are no longer enjoying immunity. Xi Jinping can kick you down if he wants to. And Lenin is all about control, building up the Communist Party as the instrument for control. That is the very essence and focus of Xi Jinping's ideas. And his ideology means that the Communist Party is meant to stay in power forever.
My guest on this occasion is Professor Steve Tsang. He's a political scientist and a historian of China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. He holds a PhD from Oxford University. He's the author of quite a few books. His latest is co-authored with Olivia Chong and is titled The Political Thought of Xi Jinping. It's just been published by Oxford University Press, and it's an extremely interesting piece of work. So, Professor, thank you so very much indeed for joining us, and I think you have a lot to say that's really important for us as we try to understand modern China.
Well, thank you.
Can I begin by making the point that all politically aware, and I would hope virtually all Westerners have heard of President Xi Jinping, but I don't know that we know very much about him. The reality is that since 2012, he's not only been the president, he's now suspended the normal two-term limit and looks like being there for the duration of his life. He's, 70-ish? Could be another 20 years when he leads that massive nation, China. Can you give us a feel for who he is? What were the crucial events in his life and his times that have shaped him and his thoughts?
We know a lot about Xi Jinping, particularly as Xi Jinping and the Communist Party would like us to know him. Well, we don't know very much about what really shaped his thinking. We only know what Xi Jinping like us to know, which is that when he was being sent down to the countryside during the Cultural Revolution, he learned a lot from the peasants, and all that inspired him and make him so much stronger and make him love the Communist Party, proud of China and all that. But a note of caution is that when the Communist Party and Xi Jinping tell us that is what we need to believe in, there is usually some element of truth in there, but it certainly is never the full picture, and it often is a distorted version of what the reality was. And the reality is that we don't really know what shaped Xi Jinping's thinking. What we do know is that he is somebody who believes that he is a transformational leader in China. He is the man who is going to bring China enormous changes. He is going to make China great again. He is going to make China the force for changing the world and making what he believes would be better for everybody if they all embrace Chinese preeminence.
Can I ask you, out of that, is there such a thing as a Chinese character, if I can put it that way? And if so, what must we understand about it in order to understand the country of China?
I think that's a really good question, because we often take a view, particularly for people in the China studies field, that China needs specialist knowledge to understand that China is different, China is special, and therefore the legitimate question of whether there's such a thing as a Chinese character. My response to that will be that no, there isn't such a thing as a Chinese character if the implication is that China is so special, it just can't and won't do things that others would do, like move progressively towards democratization and make a democracy work. We have seen that in Taiwan. Yes. And I respect people in Taiwan, the right to think whatever they are. But Taiwan is a place where people inherited the Chinese culture and civilization, and if you like, the Chinese character, and yet have transformed Taiwan into a fully functioning democracy that does not require funny definitions to make it work. So there's nothing there in the Chinese civilization, culture, or if you like, Chinese character that is fundamentally anti-democratic. Where there is, are of course, the kind of national quirks that China has, as if I may say so, Australia has, France has, and other countries also have. But that doesn't make China all that fundamentally different. But what we don't need to accept and acknowledge is that when we are looking at leaders who believe that they have a historic mission, that is simply very different. Something that perhaps could be described as a Masonic leaders syndrome. So people who believe in that sort of things behave in certain ways. Xi Jinping is one of them. Mao Zedong perhaps would be one of the others. There are a few other historical figures we could mention or think of.
You describe Xi's thought in your book as Sinocentric Consultative Leninism. Can I ask you to explain what you mean by that term?
I use the term Sinocentric Consultative Leninism to describe the political system in place in China under Xi Jinping, and it has a few key defining features. The first and foremost defining feature of it is that it is all about the preeminence of the Communist Party, that the Communist Party is what makes China into something and potentially a genuinely great nation. Without the Communist Party, China was nothing. And that is an implicit argument that China had suffered, in quotation marks, the century of humiliation until the Communist Party came up, became a definitely willing institution in China. That's what made China great. But the Communist Party did not quite deliver. It was when Xi Jinping came to power that Xi Jinping truly made the Communist Party even more vigorous, more able to deliver. Now with that, it fundamentally changes how one defines Chinese national interest. Chinese national interest therefore exists in concentric circles, with China on the outer circle, the Communist Party in the middle circle, and at the core of it is its supreme leader, Xi Jinping. And that shapes what are the top priority of China today: regime security and security of its top leader. The second thing is about getting all the people, 1.4 billion of them, to embrace the leadership of the Communist Party and the same common thinking presented by Xi Jinping thought. So the whole nation thinks as a whole, and therefore can put all its capacity and resources to make China great again. And that creates a kind of, if you like, party-centric nationalism that put China first and get all the people to work together. Then you have the element of consultation, which is that the Communist Party is constantly conscious and aware of what people are thinking and use a Maoist idea called the mass line. And the mass line is essentially that the party goes out to solicit opinions from the people, gather them, and then present the party's own version of policy on that subject, adding in small elements of the ideas that have been collected from the public, and then use the propaganda machinery to educate the entire population that the party's policy is their policy, is what they want through that consultation process. Now, with that consultation process, the party can therefore shape public opinion and shape the will of the country more effectively in driving what it is. And the fourth element is about focus on governance. And the governance here means not progressive democratic reforms, but reinforcing the Leninist party of the communists, to use it as an instrument to make and lead the country in all policy areas, and in the process, ratifying any party member who departed from the party policy, either through corruption or by political dissent. And finally, they focus on the economy, and the focus on the economy is not on the growth of the economy, but on the strength of the economy, so that China can have the world's most cutting-edge, innovative, powerful economy, and making the rest of the world asymmetrically dependent on China, but the Chinese economy not at the being dependent on the outside world. That's what the Sinocentric Consultative Leninist system is about.
It does seem almost to me that there's something of a contradiction in the idea that you build a strong economy that's globally dominant, that leads the world technologically, but you control it from the centre. It's a command economy. It's one where there are more and more restrictions put on local innovation, local thinking, the free enterprise, which has driven so much of China's success up to this point in time.
Now, personally, I agree with you. From my study of Xi Jinping's writings and words, he takes exactly the opposite view. He basically saw that the Communist Party was slightly under-delivering by his predecessors because they were not using the Communist Party as effectively as they could have to provide leadership across the board in every policy areas. He made it very, very clear at the 19th Party Congress in 2017 when he was leader for 5 years. And he said that matters not whether it is north, south, east, west, or in the middle. Matters not whether it is government, party, civil, military, university, educational, or any other walk of life. The party leads them all. There was no if, there was no but. The party leads them all. That's his formula.
Again, in 2017, I think at the same time, drawing this out of your material, he said, I quote, "The whole party must uphold Marxism, firmly consolidate the grand ideal of communism and the common ideal of socialism with Chinese characteristics." So does this mean he's really reviving a very robust Marxism and communism in China, where, as you've just alluded, all loyalties ultimately belong to the party?
We have to address this in two levels. At the formal level, Xi Jinping has time and again said that he is a Marxist. Again, no if, no but. Now, that's what he says, that's what he claims. We go beyond the official level. we dig into the reality of his policies and what he actually advocates and delivers, then he is a very funny kind of Marxist. The kind of Marxist that if you could resurrect Karl Marx from the grave, Karl Marx would not recognize. Because some of the most fundamental ideas of Marxism, like the eventual withering away of the state, like the redistribution, the principle of from whom according to ability to whom according to needs, are not there. Xi Jinping doesn't accept those, does not talk about those. When Xi Jinping says he is a Marxist, what he really meant is that he is a Leninist. And Lenin is all about control, building up the Communist Party as the instrument for control. That is the very essence and focus of Xi Jinping's ideas. And his ideology means that the Communist Party is meant to stay in power forever. Hence, no withering away of the state, because the Communist Party is absolutely essential for delivering all the positives and goods that China and therefore eventually the world will need. So, a true level of being a Marxist.
It often strikes me that the fundamental flaw in classical Marxist thinking is the idea that people will give their first loyalty to not the state so much as the party, and I don't think that fits with human nature. And it leads into my next question. You devote quite a few pages in your book to how President Xi has accomplished the, quote, successful eradication of powerful factions, from page 43. What methods has Xi used to eradicate or silence his rivals? And you might even be able to provide us with some examples. It seems to strike or illustrates this problem that in the end, you have to force people to cooperate in the greater interest if they won't willingly and voluntarily give their first loyalty to the party.
Officially, there was just one simple operation that delivered it: the anti-corruption drive that he put in place as soon as he became top leader in China in 2012. He was very, very smart, because when it was started, he built it entirely as an anti-corruption campaign.
Yeah.
Here, every word counts. Anti-corruption campaign. Now, it gave the rest of his comrades in the Communist Party a false impression that, oh yes, good old comrade Xi is just like any other comrades who became the top leader. He starts something, it's all going to blow over in a few months. Give him 6 months, then we'll get back to business. So nobody gets too worried about it. Went along with it. What Xi Jinping didn't say, but used it very skillfully to deliver, was that using the anti-corruption campaign as a trading name, what really is behind it, the other side of the coin of this operation, is a party ratification drive. A party ratification drive is something that he inherited from the Mao Zedong era as something which the top leader used to make sure that within the party there is no disloyal, weak, descending comrades. And given the system in place in China in the post-Mao era, since no ministers are paid a salary that can maintain a reasonable standard of living as a minister, every senior Chinese leader is vulnerable to the anti-corruption operation. So anybody within the party leadership who were not loyal to Xi Jinping could be and were taken down by anti-corruption campaign. And he went all the way to the forbidden area, which was that the convention of immunity for anybody holding the top rank in China, which is the Standing Committee of the Politburo of the Communist Party. Current or retired leaders holding that rank enjoy immunity for life. Xi Jinping went for one of them, a just retired security czar, former security czar, Zhou Yongkang, and brought him to justice. Now, very few people shed tears when Zhou Yongkang was brought down. But then, if you were a Politburo Standing Committee member or a former Politburo Standing Committee member, the rank that would enable you to be at the top end of a political faction within the party system in China, it would have sent a cold through your spine. You would have realized that you are no longer enjoying immunity. Xi Jinping can kick you down if he wants to. That was powerfully used as an instrument to weaken the influence of the old comrades in the party system who were usually behind those political factions. But it would still take Xi Jinping a decade until the 20-Party Congress 10 years into his rule before he fully accomplished that objective of removing all other factions from within the Communist Party. By the 20-Party Congress of 2022, the entire Communist Party could be described as the Xi Jinping faction. What then, of course, happened is that within that big faction, sub-factions would subsequently emerge. But then they were all loyal to Xi Jinping.
So you've got two problems that immediately jump out. The first is that anyone with any experience of governance, I think, understands that contestability of ideas is incredibly important to sift through policy options. And the second is that it ultimately becomes a regime of fear that has to be maintained, and that's chilling.
You are absolutely right. And that's exactly what Xi Jinping delivered by the second term of office after 2017. The Communist Party in the post-Mao Zedong era, in fact, particularly after the Beijing Mexico of 1989, increasingly opened up scope for internal policy debates at the very top.
Yes.
And that was responsible for the Communist Party not making one major policy mistake that could potentially destabilize the system when communism fell left, right, center in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. Xi Jinping replaced that collective leadership and opened debate at the very top behind closed door by an echo chamber. And we have seen since then policy mistakes being made, none of them big enough to destabilize the system, but big mistakes were being made since then. Yes, you are absolutely right.
Perhaps one of those mistakes were the extraordinary lockdowns. You refer to them in your book during COVID, which became, again to quote you, seriously unpopular and deeply damaging to the economy. How serious was the public and the party backlash in terms of what you've just said? Because in a Western country, it would have resulted in much more political pushback. Can we conclude, though, that in this case, the president was forced to change tack because the lockdowns were so unpopular?
I would be a bit more careful with describing the reversal of the zero COVID policy just after the 20-Party Congress in late November, beginning of December 2022, as Xi Jinping being forced to do so. There were demonstrations against the zero COVID policy by then, because by then it was clear that the zero COVID policy could not work The Omicron version was simply not stoppable in comparisons to the earlier variants of this COVID-19 virus, which China were able to contain when Western countries were not containing them so effectively. But by that point, with the demonstrations, Xi Jinping was still full steam ahead with zero COVID, because he made it very clear at the 20-Party Congress. Zero COVID was the right policy. Zero COVID was what made China more successful than the West. What then happened amongst those demonstrations were a small number of people who came out to demonstrate with blank sheets of paper.
Yes.
They were not demanding a reversal of zero COVID. They were demanding with a blank sheet of paper. The invisible message, if you will, was blatantly clear and obvious to Xi Jinping. They were protesting against the party's leadership, which means that his leadership. For the first time in Xi Jinping's rule, he saw the potential emergence of a popular challenge to his authority and his policy direction. Here, let me bounce back all the way to late 2012, just after Xi Jinping became leader. In his first major public policy address, he reminded everybody that we must learn the lessons that the heroic Communist Party of the Soviet Union failed to learn, which was that when a traitor like Gorbachev emerged within our ranks, comrades in the CPSU were not men enough to stand up against that. And the CPSU collapsed, and that is history. This will not happen under my watch. 2022, 10 years on, he did exactly what he promised. He saw the first sign of a challenge, and he had to clamp them down immediately, but he did more. He also removed the cause for that challenge, which is why he reversed the zero COVID policy. If he were being forced to reverse it and he had time to prepare for it, the Communist Party establishment would have worked out some arrangements to ease the zero COVID restrictions. It would not have been lifted overnight. The only person who could have lifted overnight was Xi Jinping. So it's clear to me that it was Xi Jinping trying to make sure that the security of his leadership could no longer be challenged again, that he did whatever was needed. If it means reversing a flagship policy he had committed to only a few weeks ago, so be it. That's a lesson we need to learn in terms of how Xi Jinping runs the Communist Party and China.
So in essence, you're suggesting that in fact it tightened his control on Chinese society in general.
Well, it certainly tightened his control. It doesn't make the general population in China more supportive of Xi Jinping. Because if we are looking at a completely hypothetical situation, if China were to have a genuine, open and fair election before the zero COVID policy, I think there's very little doubt that Xi Jinping would have won with a landslide.
Really?
Enormous landslide. After November, December 2022, if China were to have an open and fair elections, I don't know what the result would be. I think that will be a genuine open question as to whether Xi Jinping could win a fair and open elections after that. And that's the magnitude of changes that this successful enhancement of his control is also delivering.
Well, interestingly, on the dream of a move towards democracy in China, Xi has repeatedly said words to the effect that our party is so large and our country so huge, it is such that the party, if the party lacks the sole authority to make decisions, nothing can be achieved. Is he actually right about this? Realistically, could democracy ever be achieved in China?
Well, Xi Jinping will have to bear in mind that India now has a bigger population than China, and India is a democracy,
Yeah.
however rooted a democracy it is. So the scale of the population has historically not been an impediment for a democracy to be created and maintained and functioned. And again, we have to be realistic about democracy. Democracy, as Winston Churchill famously said, is the worst system with the exception of all the rest. The reality that Taiwan, which was under a military dictatorship of Chiang Kai-shek, was able to transition into a fully functional democracy in just about a decade, shows that really the argument that the Chinese just can't make it work is not a realistic and credible one. So with your Taiwan and your Indian experience, the Xi Jinping argument really doesn't stand up very well. But of course, Xi Jinping is not always consistent about that, because he also says that China is the best kind of democracy because China delivers the all-process democracy. And he said democracy should be measured not by your electoral cycles and how that is being managed. Democracy should be measured by whether the democracy delivers the results that should be good for the people. And the Communist Party of China delivers that better than anybody else. Therefore, the Communist Party of China delivers all-process democracy in China. The two can't be reconciled, but the man is not an intellectual. He does not need to be intellectually consistent.
Well, interestingly, of course, the lie to that, and perhaps one of the reasons that he may feel threatened by Taiwan, is that it's a democracy. And although China's come a long way in lifting its living standards and many people out of poverty, Taiwan, of course, has done much better per capita. Taiwanese people are much better off on average than people on the mainland.
Oh, I would agree with you. I think if the Communist Party is consistent, it would be in the Communist Party's interest to say that, well, Taiwan is not Chinese, so whatever happens in Taiwan doesn't really have any relevance to us. While the Communist Party insisting that Taiwan is part of China, then they are making Taiwan's success in democratic experience a very illustrative factor for citizens on the mainland of China to think about whether Chinese people can be Democrats or not.
I'd be interested, Steve, in your views on the experiences during the great age of colonialism. You referred to India, which of course was a British part of the British Empire for a long time, and people have very different views on whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. But in some ways, it has to be said the British trained up many people in India in civil service and the ideals of the law, common law, democracy, and what have you. How shaping has that been of India as a democracy, in your view, versus China, where it has to be said that it's understandable that the idea of the great humiliation would chime in the minds of a lot of Chinese people because of the way that the four powers behaved during the colonial era. I mean, it was, you can criticise as well as find good things in the way that Britain behaved in India. It's easier to find fault, I think, and to ascertain there's some justification for the idea of the great humiliation in the case of China. Do you think those 18th and 19th century behaviours have had a major influence on the two countries today? They're polar opposites. One's a democracy, one's a command, control, Leninist style country derived, I suppose you'd say, broadly from Marxism?
Well, the British imperial record is an incredibly mixed one.
Yeah.
It, I think, had delivered some positives, but it also delivered a huge amount of negatives to the societies that came under British colonial rule. The balance sheet amongst the former British colonies is therefore also a very mixed one.
Yes.
Some successful democracies and some extraordinary unsuccessful attempts at democratization as well. So I don't think the British legacy itself could have explained for all those differences, but clearly India inherited the British institutions and a lot of the British ways of doing things, which enable India to be better placed to deliver the democracy. Bearing in mind, that same thing did not happen so well with Pakistan or Bangladesh, which were also part of the British Indian Empire. So not one linear direction of travel there. In terms of the Chinese experience, equally is not a linear experience. Taiwan again comes in readily for that comparison. Now, one can easily argue that Taiwan was under Japanese imperial rule for 50 years, from 1895 to 1945, and therefore had a different experience, except for the government that governs Taiwan since 1945. And that was the government of Chiang Kai-shek. And Chiang Kai-shek was the ruler of China from 1927 until he was forced out of China in 1949. So everything the Communist Party talked about in terms of the century of humiliation, Chiang Kai-shek was at the forefront of dealing with it in that period of humiliation. And the Communist Party's version of history simply do not accord with the reality, because the Communist Party will say that it was the Communist Party that put an end to the century of humiliation. Not true. It was Chiang Kai-shek who did it. It was in the middle of the Second World War that Chiang Kai-shek secured the abolition of all the unequal treaties that were imposed on China against the last imperial dynasty in China. It was in the middle of the Second World War that Chiang Kai-shek secured the support of American President Franklin D. Roosevelt to be a founding member of the United Nations, which would become a veto-holding permanent member of the Security Council. And you could not have a more spectacular way of ending the century of humiliation by China becoming the founder of the New World Order at the end of the Second World War in 1945, 4 long years before the Communist Party came to power in China. And none of what the Communist Party talked about in terms of that century of humiliation, which Chiang Kai-shek's government carried over to Taiwan, could not deal with when the time for democratization came. So the same thing that the Communist Party claims that cannot be done in China, in fact, has already happened in a part of China that is claimed by the Communist Party, though the people in that part of the world would like to call themselves something else.
Fascinating insights. On this issue of the need to, if you like, demand loyalty to the party when people don't want to give it voluntarily, you have written of what is being created as a complete ecosystem for mass surveillance. What exactly does this look like? We hear stories of 400 million surveillance cameras and a massive internal security apparatus that perhaps consumes even more money than the aggressive build-up of the armed forces. I don't know whether those numbers are broadly right. But what does this mass surveillance ecosystem that you talk of look like, in your words? And can you describe the social credit system that is evidently part of it?
What China has under Xi Jinping is a system of surveillance that combines the most advanced digital technology with the old-fashioned Communist Party mass surveillance operations. So it's both through the human side of observing each other, as well as the electronic side of surveillance. So you have all the digital cameras, you have the facial recognition system, software put in place. You also have people, particularly through the Communist Party itself, monitoring each other. And you also have an enormous operation of brainwashing the entire population. The entire education system, from kindergarten to graduate school at universities, now needs to teach the thoughts of Xi Jinping. And of course, people are also required or asked to use an app, which is called 学习全国, in order to learn Xi Jinping's thought on a daily basis. And unlike the Cultural Revolution era of Mao Zedong's Little Red Book, where everybody had to carry one in their pocket and recite them every day, the app actually monitors how much you use and therefore will be able to assess whether you are learning Xi Jinping's thought
wow.
or not on a daily basis. So this is the kind of surveillance we are looking at. The social credit system is one of those pieces of instruments in that wide armory of control. The social credit system essentially provides both carrot and stick, that if you do certain things, then you gain a credit for which you will have privileges being granted. And if you don't do certain things, you get punished for not doing them. So it provides a kind of incentive system for people to do things and remind them that they are under surveillance. So people know they are being watched. Big Brother is here everywhere.
So I find myself wondering, do Chinese people sit around the coffee table out on the sidewalk saying to themselves or to one another, oh, I've done well, I've earned another 100 credit points today, isn't that wonderful, I will get more privileges? Or do they say under their breath, this is terrifying, I feel I don't have any freedom? Which line of thinking wins out?
I think a third line of thinking wins out, which is that the Chinese behave like human beings have always behaved in human history, which is that you ignore the kind of pressure that you are facing on a daily basis and you just get on with life as if it wasn't there. Because if you are thinking about the social credit system on a daily basis, it will drive you crazy. And you can't live a life like that. Chinese will not. So most people, most of the time, focus on the soft issues which won't get them into trouble and avoid the hard issues that can get them into trouble when they're talking about things. They talk about film stars, they talk about singers, they talk about ways to go for a good meal and have a good beer. They don't talk about what do we do about Xi Jinping? Am I getting really good social credit? Gosh, that one really hit me. Sometimes they do, but mostly they don't.
Yeah, unique way of controlling people, I have to say. Can I ask you, for the younger generations, Xi plainly expects them to be fully committed to and to embrace and to love China and the party, and presumably he himself as their great leader. All three are being sort of merged together in the name of patriotism. How does this sort of commitment to ideological indoctrination play out in the education system from primary schools through to universities?
It plays out remarkably effectively. I mean, there are always some who do not go along with that. That's the strength of the human mind. Some of us always manage to maintain that critical mind and therefore not simply accept what we are being told. But the overwhelming majority of people simply buy into what they are being fed on a daily basis. The lessons of George Orwell in 1994 hits home remarkably effectively. If you repeat an untruth often enough, people believe in it. Your classic example is, for example, China's claim that Taiwan is a sacred territory of China. That's what most people in China heard about. No other versions of it, so they buy it. They ignore the historical reality that the PRC have never for one day or 1 second exercised jurisdictions over Taiwan. They ignore the fact that before November 1943, the single biggest advocate that Taiwan should be an independent state was the Communist Party of China under Chairman Mao Zedong. That's a fact, but most people don't know that. And that tells you how effective that indoctrination through the education system normally is, because you don't know better.
It's a
so
sort
you
of,
believe in what you're told.
It sort of has a rough parallel, isn't it? The awful truth is that most of us, if we'd been young people in Germany during the 1930s, would have joined the Hitler Youth.
Well, indeed. Or for that matter, it wasn't that far back when Western democracies could be talking about human rights and could have completely segregation policies in place without people finding that being problematic or offensive. And also discrimination against their own color because of gender or religious differences. When people were not thinking about them, they were not issues.
So with that sort of control, even if the economy weakens, because economic theory down through the ages, I think, has demonstrated pretty clearly that if you stifle individual and local enterprise, you do slow economic growth. And that economic miracle that's been based really on, if you like, the development of a free market economy in China from 1978 on, that's coming to an end. It will impact the prosperity of the country and mean that opportunities are limited. But with that level of control, it isn't really going to matter much, is it? After Tiananmen Square, there was a sort of broad view that, okay, we'll accept that you communists are in control, but just give us a better life. There was a sort of a compact there. It doesn't matter now, does it? The control's so tight. We've never had the technology in the hands of a totalitarian regime of the sort we've just been talking about to so control people that it's hard to know how it might come to an end.
I think you are absolutely spot on there, John, if I may say so. And two things here. One, Xi Jinping has changed the social contract, the de facto social contract. Previously, it was quite simply, as you say, that the Communist Party promised people that the living standards will be improved, tomorrow will be a better day for you than today, in return for you supporting the Communist Party with its increasingly authoritarian and sometimes nearly dictatorial approach to governance. Now Xi Jinping is saying that making tomorrow better means making you more proud as a Chinese citizen. And the Communist Party is making China standing taller and taller in the world. We're making you proud. That compensates for a bit of slowing economic growth and changes to your living standards, because you are a proud Chinese patriot now that you were not before. That goes a bit of distance in helping with that. The second thing is, of course, if I may be very cheeky in saying it, the Robert Mugabe syndrome.
Yeah.
You could have a leader who enjoys the support of all the state power and security and military support, who could run a relatively strong economy to the ground for a very long time before you have to face the reckoning. Now, China is a much richer, stronger economy than Zimbabwe's economy was upon independence. So there is a lot more resources at Xi Jinping's disposal before you will necessarily have to face that reckoning. So the challenge of a popular revolt in China being able to get rid of Xi Jinping, I think, is very remote. If he is going to be removed, it would have to be something that trigger a courageous rebellion within the top echelon of the Communist Party. And again, that's going to be very, very difficult to come by because all top leaders today are being watched. If you were members of the Politburo, the top 24, 25 leaders in China, you don't meet one-on-one with your colleague. You will have to meet at least in a group. Because one-on-one is when you can plot. And that's not allowed.
When I visited China in 2001 on a trade mission and met with the then president, Xi, many of the conversations I had formally and informally touched on the problem of China's burgeoning population. And very strong language was used in those days about how it presented enormous challenges and would have to be brought to heel. Now, of course, we have a depopulation bomb affecting much of the world and China leads the pack. This poses a whole set of dilemmas, I would have thought, for the Chinese economy in general and for the Communist Party in particular. There are enormous challenges that come with the idea of a very rapidly aging population and a quite staggering predicted drop in the actual population of China.
Yes, but the demographics in the long term is going to be an enormous challenge for China and its economy. But in the short to medium terms, I think the effect is very, very small. Demographic is a very slow-moving process. Even if we are looking at the issue of whether China will use force against Taiwan, we are talking about something that's going to happen, if it's going to happen in the next 20 years or so. So the people who would be conscripted to make the invasion have already been born. So the shrinking population is not going to reduce the relevant population size that will be relevant for an invasion. And the same thing happens with the economy. But the about turn of the Communist Party on the issue of demographics shows you that the very top-down approach, where the party or the top leader knows best, really causes problems in the long term. The kind of demographic problems China faces today could have been predicted and were predicted by demographers a generation back. But they were not taken into account by the top leadership at the time, reflecting in your conversations with Zhu Rongji. And Zhu Rongji was one of the more, relatively speaking, more open-minded premiers of China who had a much more pragmatic approach to managing the economy and policies generally. He didn't get it. He couldn't get it because he wasn't hearing what he needed to hear. Remember what I said? The scope for internal debate was opened in the Zhongji era for the top party leaders, but it wasn't for all technical experts. So your best demographers in China were not part of that conversation.
Points again to the need for contestability of advice for leaders, and reminds me again of the old Lord Acton saying that the problem with power is that it does corrupt, and absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely. These are troubling realities, I think. Can I ask you, in the West, we do hear from time to time quite strong protests made about human rights abuses in China. Does that have any impact at all on President Xi? After all, you mentioned that he was caught up in the Cultural Revolution, sent off to presumably a pretty harsh environment out in the countryside. Would that have, in any sense, tripped a sense of humanity in him and concern for people who are less well off, or is he just not interested in what the world might have to say about human rights issues in his country? It certainly seems to publicly draw a lot of anger when the outside world comments. But what does it really mean in Beijing?
Well, when outside countries or individuals complain about Chinese human rights, those countries or individuals will be presented as anti-China.
Yeah.
And that's why they were taking issues on any subject about the situations in China, including human rights. From Xi Jinping's perspective, human rights in China is amazingly well. I mean, what you might see as a very problematic repression of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, he would see it as leveling up the Uyghurs to make them proper Chinese patriots, so that they understand what being a proper Chinese would be, and could therefore have their full potential developed. All this happened with subsidies from China. All those security operations are very expensive, and the central governments are paying for them to make it and provide that re-education facilities to make these people like proper patriotic Chinese. So he doesn't actually see any reason why that kind of criticism should be reasonable, justified, and acceptable. That's not to say external criticisms, like the former High Commissioner for Human Rights of the United Nations, saying that in her final parting report of human rights in China that what happened in Xinjiang could amount to crimes against humanity. It doesn't matter. It matters a lot, because Xi Jinping's global ambition is for China to be embraced and admired as the most magnificent, fantastic, modern, powerful, rich, innovative, civilized country in the world. That kind of criticism goes against his ambition. So it does have some effect, but it will not change how he manages things. He circles the wagon.
In Australia, we've certainly been the victims of what was called for a while the wolf warrior diplomacy approach. Very, very tough words indeed out of China. And that seems to have been reversed. Has there been a sense that it hasn't worked very well, or at least curtailed, if not reversed?
I wouldn't go that far. I think what we have to see is that wolf warrior diplomacy is a term we have coined in the West to describe what happens with the conduct of some of China's senior diplomats.
Yes.
Over the last 40 years, including during the time when you were in government in Australia, you would have seen that the quality of Chinese diplomats has substantially improved, became a lot more professional in how they could manage diplomacy. So the emergence of wolf warrior diplomats goes against the general direction of travel of the development and maturing of the Chinese diplomatic corps. They came about because Xi Jinping insisted that all Chinese diplomats and all Chinese government officials and party cadres must not be afraid to unsheathe their swords and defend the honor of China wherever there they may be. And that is, in fact, a call for diplomats to behave like wolf warriors. No wolf warrior who have caused huge backlash in the West have ever been punished. So there is nothing that would have stopped them from doing it. But at the moment, the Chinese economy is not doing very well. China needs to patch up some of the major economic relationships in order to make sure that the economy does not fall even further. And therefore, the wolf warriors are being contained for the moment. But I can readily see the wolf warriors coming back out again when things are looking a bit more positive, and they think that it is more in their interest to demonstrate their commitments to defend China's honor and dignity in the audience of one, who is Xi Jinping.
Well, you've mentioned China's desire to, if you like, be seen as a respected and loved global leader, but they plainly see the West as weak and divided, and on a road to decline. How do they exploit those perceived weaknesses, in your view?
Much more effectively than I think we are giving them credit for. We have a tendency in the Western democracies to see the world through our own perspectives and our own interests. And we forget that in country terms and in population terms, the so-called democratic West is a minority in the world community.
Yes.
The vast majority of countries in the world, which the Chinese call the global South, are poorer countries, and they are autocracies, outright autocracies, or so deeply flawed democracies that you have difficulties really reconciling the description of any variant of democracy with them. Now, those are the countries where China focuses their attentions to win their support. And with their support, and that is the really fantastic bit of it, they can go about to deliver what Xi Jinping promised as the democratization of international relations. Because with their support, China, as the forever a member of the global South, exact words from Xi Jinping, forever a member of the global South. Therefore, the natural leader of the global South will be able to speak on behalf of the global South at the UN and the UN agencies and require the international organizations like UN to put the interests of the global South, the majority of the people and the countries in the world, ahead of the minority which had unfairly and unjustly monopolized the leadership roles and agenda-setting roles at those international organizations. Now, all this may come across to a Western audience as, what on earth is it all about? But if you were a leader of an autocracy in the global South, it sounds rather good, because the Chinese are delivering things that you like. The Chinese are telling you that if you support the old system, these democratic West are imposing conditionalities on how you should govern your own country. But we are putting forward the global civilization initiative, telling you and everybody else that every country have the right to choose their own way of governance. You, as leader of your own country, can do whatever you want with your domestic policies and your domestic populations. And nobody else, individual country or grouping of countries, has the right to tell you otherwise. We got your back. just vote for us at the UN. What's there not to like? Why is it so difficult for us to see that China's approach actually does have traction in a large part of the world?
So the strategy to establish and consolidate Chinese leadership in international organisations and on the global stage is actually succeeding, in your view?
Well, we have already seen how, for example, the Human Rights Council, since its foundations, have changed in how it deals with human rights issues in China. Before the Human Rights Council was being created, and China was a founding member of the Human Rights Council, China was a regular customer of the previous Human Rights Commission at the UN for criticism on an annual basis. Since the Human Rights Council was created, and China being a founding member of it, we are not seeing that. Even though when China was under annual criticism, the record of human rights was being improved on an annual basis, and China has since then committed human rights abuse that we have not seen for a very long time in China. So they have already delivered that. Look at the way how UNDESA operates, the UN Department for Economic and Social Affairs. It's been under a Chinese head for a long time. It sets agendas. It has the powers to say who can enter and not enter UN premises. And it has changed the way how the department works. Taiwanese, Chinese dissidents, critics of China can be and are now denied access to UN properties and therefore access to UN agencies. We're already seeing that happening. I can go on.
Well, you frankly state that President Xi's commitment to one country as part of this rearrangement of global order means that he's serious about using force to take Taiwan. You see aggressive expansionism as undoubtedly part of China's agenda then?
That's a really good question. Again, the Chinese won't see it as any demonstration of expansionism because the Chinese claim Taiwan as Chinese. So if China takes a Chinese territory back, how can it be expansionism? Now, that's a clever argument. And for countries that don't really look into the realities and the history of Taiwan, they can readily buy that argument. But for countries that do look at the history and international law, that the Chinese argument doesn't carry any water. The commitment to take Taiwan is absolutely true. It's part of the one country formulation. It's also part of China's global ambition. And that global ambition is called by Xi Jinping as the China dream of national rejuvenation. So you cannot have China being rejuvenated without China being made whole again. And therefore, taking Taiwan is critical. But taking Taiwan is also being elevated to a matter of great geostrategic and geopolitical importance. Taiwan happens to be in the middle of the first island chain off the east coast of China. If China can take Taiwan, it will not only secure the entire eastern seaboard, which is where the heart of Chinese economy and industries and economic capacities are located, it also means China is able to project power into the Pacific, pushing the Americans back to the second island chain, which is the island chain where all the American-owned islands and bases are located, delivering what Xi Jinping told President Barack Obama back in 2013 at Sunnyland in California, that the Pacific Ocean was very big. It was big enough for two. What Xi Jinping didn't spell out was, of course, that it means you keep to your side of the Pacific, I'll keep to mine. And Taiwan cannot be taken effectively without China using force. because a medium power that is a democracy has historically never, ever surrendered under existential external threat. Taiwan is a medium power, very proud of its democratic system. So China will have to use force to take Taiwan, and doing so means China will have to deter the United States from interfering, because the United States is committed under an American law, the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979, to offer Taiwan assistance for its self-defense if its status were to be forcibly changed against its will. And if China can deter the United States, or if China can defeat or inflict sufficient losses on the Americans interfering to support Taiwan and then force the Americans to pull back, then China would have completely changed the strategic equation in the Indo-Pacific. Japan could no longer depend on the United States under the US-Japan Mutual Defense Alliance, nor would South Korea. ASEAN 10 will do their deals with China. The whole balance of the region will change. Even NATO will have to start to question whether American commitments under NATO could be relied on in a genuine big crisis rather than a minor one. And the status of the United States globally could potentially be damaged. China will rise substantially in its global standing. That's why Taiwan is such a big deal for Xi Jinping, as part of the fulfillment of the China dream of national rejuvenation.
I often wonder why it's not more broadly recognized that Japan is a formidable military power and naval power in its own right and could not stand by, in my view, and watch that happen. They would move, and together with the Americans would remain, I would think, a very formidable problem for any Chinese military aggression or plans around military aggression?
I think you are completely right. I would agree with you that the likelihood is that if the Chinese invade Taiwan, the Japanese would be dragged into it one way or the other, not least because so many of U.S. military capabilities are based on Japanese soil, and therefore the Japanese will have to defend bases that U.S. forces will be operating to support operations in the Taiwan area. I think the Chinese have generally factored that in as well, but they still see the United States as the primary peer competitor. If they can sort out the United States, Japan wouldn't be a problem. The reality that Japan does not have a regular Navy, Air Force, or Army, but only have self-defense forces with very strict restrictions on their operations and also the kind of equipment they have. Even for the same F-15 or F-35 aircraft, the Japanese versions usually are equipped for defensive and not for offensive operations. That, again, to the Chinese are helpful considerations in terms of thinking about how to deal with Japan.
The big question arises, of course, out of all of this, and that is, will the West shake off its self-loathing and its division and say we will stand up for our values? We do believe in democracy and we will defend it. To what extent do you think the West has the power to slow China's economy? You've seen the Americans move quite decisively there. It now looks as though the Europeans are going to move, for example, on the dumping of electric vehicles. And you touched on it yourself earlier. The Chinese at the moment are being nicer because their economy's in trouble. How much leverage could the West apply in your view?
I think we have to be very careful here for two reasons. One, the West is not a united, coherent unit. It's a potential coalition of the willing in a moment of crisis. I would expect that if we ever face a crisis which amounts to a challenge to the democratic values, we would somehow came together as a coalition of the willing to respond. For dealing with a crisis that already emerged, what we need is something much more than that. What we need is a capacity to deter China economically. We have to bear in mind the mainstream thinking in Washington on deterring China is misguided, because the mainstream thinking is military deterrence. Military deterrence against China cannot work. Deterrence works not because you have the capabilities to do so. That's a basic requirement, but that's not enough. Deterrence works when the one to be deterred understands the effectiveness of deterrence and acts on it. Now, the Chinese policy-making process no longer allows scope for the Chinese party state to be deterred by the Americans. Because of the change in the way how the top policy institutions work, no general or admiral in the Chinese system will dare to tell Xi Jinping that China must act on American deterrence, because otherwise we are going to get a hell of a beating. We can't win. You say that you're politically cashier right now. You go to war, war's unpredictable. China may not actually lose. If China loses, you can pin the blame on somebody else. You may get away with it. It may not affect you. So no general or admiral will have a reason to cancel the acceptance of deterrence. What then is needed is a deterrence that Xi Jinping himself can see, understands, and have a strong incentive to act. And that comes to economic deterrence. If the Chinese economy will be utterly devastated, then Xi Jinping will have a reason to think about whether this is something worth doing, because it could be the beginning of the end of his rule in China. Okay, let's look at something practical. If we are looking at the trade between China and the leading Western democracies, US, EU, Canada, Australia, UK, Japan, South Korea, we're talking about nearly 50% of China's external trade. If they collectively, at the point when Xi Jinping was poised to invade Taiwan, speak with one voice and basically say to China, please don't do it, because if you did, we will cut off our economic relations with you. We will each suffer several percentage points drop in our GDP. But we can manage that. It will be hugely difficult, but we could manage that. You will lose 50% of your external economy. No government can survive that easily. And Xi Jinping will know he will be risking his own hold to power to take Taiwan. And taking Taiwan to fulfill the China dream is what he wants to do. That is life mission. But staying in power is the most basic thing that he must do, his absolute top priority. Hence, I think if we can deliver that, we can deter him. And that is why I am not in favor of economic decoupling with China. If we decouple too much with China, we will end up reducing that economic leverage. And what I propose is not mutually assured economic destruction, is asymmetric economic destruction. But it means we still have to have strong economic links with China. What we must do is to reduce the risk element of some part of the economic integration, but not the scale of the economic integration.
Well, you've given us a lot of time, and those insights are gold. Thank you very much indeed. Can I ask you at a personal level, you may prefer not to answer this, but what are the implications for you and your co-author, Olivia Chong, for writing the book? Would you feel free to go to China at the moment?
No, I think I understand the system well enough to realize that the best outcome for me is that I do not get a visa to go to China. The worst outcome will be that I am so beloved by the Chinese authorities that they would like me to stay on rather longer than I would myself like to. So no, I think I accept the consequences of delivering scholarship as scholars are expected to do. If you speak without fear or favor, sometimes there is a price to pay.
Well, I salute your scholarship and your courage, and I wish you well. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, John. It's been a great pleasure.